Okay, so having seen what an argument map is, and since I've explained why it is that one would take an interest in the Hollis case, let's look at the first three maps in the report. Now, these are foundational. If there isn't some fundamental flaw in this set of three maps, then I believe what they establish is that there is a case to answer, that we must look at the Hollis case. And in its simplest terms, this is why. What these three maps show, one after another, is that it is agreed. It is agreed by every serious authority on both sides of the Iron Curtain and on both sides of the Hollis dispute, including by the authorised historian, that there was, at least in the early 1940s, up to 1945, a GRU, that is to say, a Soviet military intelligence, not a KGB, a GRU mole inside MI5 with access to Russian espionage operations material and lists of communists of interest in Britain, and that GRU mole had the code name Ellie. Now, there was a time when this was in dispute. It is not in dispute any longer by any serious party to this matter. That's point one. That's our point of departure, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. The second leg, which we'll look at after that, is that whereas the authorised historian says, yes, there was such a GRU mole, but we now know that it was Leo Long, the thing is that his argument that it's Leo Long is untenable. Untenable. Now, this is terribly important. This is what struck me when I read the authorised history first, that claim is made and that it hasn't a leg to stand on. Now, if I'm in error about that, if it could be shown that Leo Long was in fact the mole Ellie, then it would of course become, to say the least, plausible, as the authorised historian insists, that the case against Hollis falls over. So that map's very important. But the third map is that because it seems clear that it was not in fact Leo Long, suspicion reverts to Roger Hollis, not as a matter of speculation, but because there was a mole codenamed Ellie, and Hollis has always been the primary suspect. And there is a great deal of evidence that seems to point to Hollis. So if it was not, as map 2 argues, Leo Long, we must go back to the Hollis case and say, what's going on here? What are we missing? Let's get this clear at long last. Those are the three maps. Let me step you through them one at a time. So the first map is simply laying out the grounds for believing that there was a GRU mole in MI5 in the 1940s, codenamed Ellie. Why would we believe that? Notice that at the very top level, this is a map structure structurally similar to the Socrates map. The contention is that there was such a mole codenamed Ellie, and there are two component parts to that, just as with the Socrates map. The first part is that there was a GRU mole in MI5 between 1940 and 1945. The second part is that that mole's code name was Ellie. Let's take these one at a time. There are two basic arguments. The first is that very early on in 1940, when the Soviet defector Walter Krivitsky was debriefed by MI5, a report based on his debrief was written up, and from inside MI5, it landed in Moscow very quickly. That indicated, almost certainly, in 1940 that there was a Soviet mole inside MI5, but no defector had yet pointed to one. Subsequent to that, however, before 1945, and most signally in 1945, in the case of Igor Gurzenko, several Soviet agents or defectors said that there was a GRU mole inside MI5. The key one was Igor Gurzenko. So these are the primary reasons for believing that there was, at that period of time, a GRU mole inside MI5. And as you can see in the map, and you have it in front of you, that's then underpinned by the supporting evidence. The second part of the argument, however, and let me just bring this up now, is that that mole in MI5 was codenamed Ellie. Now, we have, again, redundant evidence for this. Not only did defectors state that that was the case, that there was a mole and the codename was Ellie, but importantly, and this didn't happen until after the end of the Cold War, very top-level Soviet intelligence documents indicate that Moscow Centre knew and acknowledged to its field agents and embassy in London in 1945 that Guzenko had blown the gaff on the GRU mole in MI5, codenamed Ellie. That's about as hard an evidence as you could reasonably wish to get. But further to that, the authorised historian agrees that there was such a mole, codenamed Ellie. And this is worth noting because in the 1980s, Gordon Brooks-Shepard wrote a book about Soviet moles and spies, and he claimed in that book that there never had been an Ellie in MI5. He claimed that Igor Guzenko had fantasised this well after 1945, had made it up in trying to look important and suggested he still had important information. Brooks-Shepard was in error, and it's quite interesting that he would have made that claim since he was being encouraged in his work and briefed by MI5. When the authorised historian a generation later comes to the case, because material has come out since the end of the Cold War which makes unambiguously clear that there was indeed such a mole, he no longer takes the Brooks-Shepard line. So it's agreed across the board there was such a mole and the codename was Ellie. So this is our bedrock. This is our point of departure. There is no paranoid conspiracy theory imagining a GRU mole in MI5. There is complete and documented consensus that there was a GRU mole in MI5, codenamed Ellie. That brings us to the second map because, of course, once we agree that there was, it's a very real and live question as to who that mole was. And as you know, and as I pointed out already, the authorised historian's answer is yes, but we now know, that it was Leo Long. This makes map 2 absolutely crucial. And I can't insist too clearly that if it could be shown that the map I'm about to show you is flawed in terms of inference or evidence, and that there's a strong case that Ellie really was Leo Long, good. But I don't think that there is such a flaw in the map. And it makes it the centrepiece really for the case that we have to look at Hollis. So let's turn and have a look at that map. So you can now see again in front of you as well as on the large screen here, map 2. The central contention is that the GRU mole in MI5 was Leo Long. That's the authorised historian's claim. We've simply noted 1A that is his claim. But fundamentally, why would anybody believe that? Well, that Leo Long was a Soviet mole is crucial, and that Long was specifically a GRU mole is crucial. And notice we've broken those two parts, or taken them apart, as component elements of one reason. Because there's good reasons for believing that Leo Long was in fact a Soviet agent, Soviet mole. However, he was not a GRU mole, he was a KGB mole. So if we go back to the elements of argument mapping, what we can see is here 1B, the major premise, is certainly correct. 1C, however, that he was a GRU mole is not correct. And this is the first flaw in the authorised historian's argument. Why is 1B not correct? Because Long was not GRU, he was KGB. He was recruited for the KGB by Anthony Blunt, who was a KGB agent, one of the Cambridge Five. Secondly, and this is even more disturbing to the authorised version, as it were, is that Long did not work in MI5. This is what particularly bewildered me when I read the authorised history, that it was simply blithely stated that Leo Long was Ellie, when in fact, to the best of my knowledge and that of every serious intelligence professional I've consulted, Leo Long never worked in MI5. He worked in MI14 in the War Office on German order of battle. So he's a KGB sub-agent in MI14. How could he have been Ellie? Well, according to the authorised historian, Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB defector, said, I've seen the file on Leo Long in the KGB's offices, and it has in bold letters on it the codename Ellie. Gordievsky, unlike Guzenko, appears to have fantasised this because we now have access since the end of the Cold War to Leo Long's file, and it is indeed a KGB file, not a GRU file, and the codename on it is not Ellie, it's Ralph. So the authorised historian appears to have a very fundamental problem. His candidate for being the GRU mole in MI5 in the 1940s wasn't MI5, wasn't a GRU mole or agent, and didn't have the codename Ellie. What am I missing here? If you're the authorised historian, if you're sceptical about the case, it seems to me right here is where you need to make a stand. Because if this critique holds up, then it seems to me we have to conclude that the identity of Ellie is an unsolved question. And that takes us straight to map 3. And map 3 is that given that Leo Long cannot have been Ellie, suspicion must, in the nature of the case, revert to Hollis. Why is that? Well, let's look at map 3. What you can see on the screen in front of you is a compressed version of the map you can see on paper. And you'll see that, again, I've compressed it to the very top level. So fundamentally, why is it that given that Long cannot have been Ellie, suspicion reverts to Hollis? For 2 reasons. One is that other than Hollis, there's a very small pool of potential candidates to have been Ellie. Let's be clear about this. We know who worked in MI5 at that time. This is something that can be checked. We also know that early on, when internal investigators in MI5 concluded that they believed there was a mole in MI5, they had suspicions about a small number of people, and all those people were looked at. And by common consent, including that of the authorised historian and the investigators, they reached the conclusion in the 60s and 70s that it kept coming back to Hollis. It was not Dick White. It was not Guy Liddell. It was not Graham Mitchell. Now, this is an important component part of it. It is, of course, logically possible that those investigators missed something. And there's 2 possible ways that that could be explored. Let me just open up the subcomponents of that part of the map to show specifically where we would point and where such a cross-examination might go if one conceded that, okay, it wasn't Leo Long, but we're not prepared to accept that it had to be Hollis. We want to look elsewhere. So if you look at this, what you can see is the candidate, whoever Ellie was, would have had to have unrestricted access to files on Russia, on counter-espionage and nuclear secrets between 1941 and 1945. That was Ellie. And this limits the number of possible candidates to a small pool of people. Secondly, we know who those people were. This is the underpinnings of 1B. Those people have been looked at and they've been cleared. Now, what I want to point to here is that of all that node, of all that argumentation, the one place that a rational critique could plausibly go is to say, I would want to cross-check whether those people were in fact rightly cleared. And that's completely legitimate. And so one possible line of inquiry is to say, before we go down the path of the systematic indictment of Hollis, we want to cross-check that. Splendid. If anybody could show that there is a strong case against any one of those other candidates, or in theory, some other member of MI5 at that time who it could be shown in retrospect had that kind of access and met that description, then splendid. But it has not yet been done. It has not been done. Let's therefore look at the other side of this argument. Since for so long, until the authorised historian made the claim that Ellie was Leo Long, suspicion always circled around Roger Hollis. Let's look at why that would be the case and why suspicion should, in the nature of the case now, revert to Hollis. This, you can see, is a more elaborate map. It has 2 component parts. That Hollis has always been, as I've stated more than once, uniquely suspect in this case. How do we know that? Because internal inquiries pointed to him again and again. The Fluency Committee, the K7 Committee, the 1960s and 1970s said to the Director General of MI5, when we look at this, we keep being led back to Roger Hollis. Secondly, apart from the internal investigations, we know that the FBI and other members of the US intelligence community, and we saw a little of this in the introductory video at the beginning of this afternoon, suspected Roger Hollis back in the 60s and 70s also. So there's both internal concern and there's external concern. And thirdly, in the 1980s, as more material started to come to light, Chapman Pincher began writing what ended up being a series of books in which he said, there's a serious problem here and it's really being covered up by the British government. And it points to Roger Hollis having been a Soviet mole. That's why, on the face of it, you have to say Hollis has been uniquely suspect. Is he guilty? Well, that's the object of the inquiry here. But let's just drive home this consideration that there was an Ellie, that it cannot have been Leo Long, and that Hollis has always been the prime suspect. This is our point of departure for the inquiry. The other aspect of this map is that the suspicions regarding Hollis have never been adequately dealt with. Now, this doesn't begin and end with the authorised historian. I can't emphasise too much that when I turned to read the defence of the realm, the authorised history, I genuinely accepted that he may well have buried this case against Hollis, and I wanted to find out exactly how he'd done it. And as you all know, my firm belief is that he was very far from having done that. He failed the test in that particular respect. But he wasn't the first to do that. The earlier inquiries had not done an adequate job, and for two reasons. One is that even the internal inquiries, including those by Arthur Martin and Peter Wright, which the authorised historian dismisses as paranoid, didn't adequately understand the nature of the problem, and they didn't understand that the GRU and the KGB in Hollis's era operated separately. So there was confusion as to whether Ellie was supposed to have been a GRU or KGB, or whether it made any difference. And note that in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher finally stood up in the House and said, we've looked into this matter, and Hollis was not a KGB spy. She was correct, he wasn't a KGB spy. He was, on the face of it, however, and certainly Ellie was, a GRU spy. And that confusion is also fundamental to this inquiry. So when you consider that earlier inquiries were at times confused and incomplete, when you consider that the authorised historian has failed to correct that, when you consider that a great deal of new information has come out since the end of the Cold War bearing on this matter, it's clear, it seems to me, that the case against Hollis has never been adequately dealt with. And a fundamental premise of this forum is that it's time it was.